All right, well, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at Leviticus 18. We're going to exegete the text, and we're going to specifically look at the issue of homosexuality because this text is probably abused the most by our culture. Our culture is continually trying to argue that in fact, you don't need to worry about this passage, that it's just in Leviticus and, it means something else. It means something that you don't think it means. That it's not applying to our situation today when it comes to homosexual monogamous relationships or marriage or whatever. So I thought what we'd do is really lay a foundation for, I think, a proper interpretation of Leviticus 18, understand its canonical context and what it's interacting with itself, understand the principle behind all of these laws that you see within it, and then relate that, of course, to the specific exegesis of the passages concerning homosexuality, particularly verse 22 here. We'll also take a look at chapter 20, where the law again is repeated there, but with an actual punishment, and we'll discuss that as well. So let's take a look at the passage now. We'll go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the English, and because I don't want to lose you on the Hebrew, but just know that the same thing is true of the English that's true of the Hebrew for the most part. We're going to look at how maybe some translations are not as good, and discuss the Hebrew, but I want you to see the larger framework of the passage first. So let's go to Leviticus 18, and if you'll notice, I have this highlighted here in chapter 18, verses 1 through 5 here. You've got, the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to the Israelites and tell them, I am Yahweh your God. You must not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you have been living, and you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, into which I am about to bring you. You must not walk in their statutes, that is, their cultural ideas of what they think is right and wrong. You must observe my regulations, sharp contrast, not their statutes, not their regulations, my statutes, my regulations, and you must be sure to walk in my statutes, that is, live in accordance with what I've said, not in accordance with what they have said, what they think is true. I am Yahweh, your God. So Yahweh is your God, not the people in your cultures. So they don't get to decide what's true and what's right and what's wrong. God does. So you must keep my statutes and my regulations. Notice how much he's repeating that. Anyone who does so will live by keeping them. I am Yahweh. Well, we're going to skip over the actual regulations and laws for a minute and then go down here to verse 24. Do not defile yourselves with any of these things, for the nations which I am about to drive out before you, speaking of the Canaanites again, have been defiled with all these things. So they've been corrupted and brought to no use. Therefore, the land has become unclean. It's not being used the way it should be. And I have brought the punishment for its iniquity upon it, so that the land has vomited out its inhabitants. You yourselves must obey my statutes and my regulations. Here we go again. And must not do any of these abominations. Notice, this is really important. All of them are going to be called abominations, not just homosexuality. All of them are abominations. All of them are detestable in the sight of God. These are regulations and statutes both for the native citizen, that is the actual Israelite, the ethnic Israelite, and the resident foreigner, that's the ger, in your midst. The ger, of course, is the non-Israelite, if you want to put it that way. So they're non-native, they're not ethnic Israel, but they've joined religiously. They've joined Israel in that regard. For the people who are in the land before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become unclean. So do not make the land vomit you out, because you defile it, just as it vomited out the nations that were before you. For if anyone does any of these abominations, the persons who do them will be cut off from the midst of their people. You must obey my charge to not practice any of the abominable statutes Notice how much he's repeating that. That have been done before you, so that you do not defile yourselves by them. I am Yahweh, your God. So what this does, if you notice, between this section here that I've highlighted and the original section, or the beginning section of chapter 18, is that it creates an inclusio. These are the statutes of God versus the understanding of the people as to what's okay. Very important to understand. This is not the understanding of Israel and the statutes of Israel versus the nations. This is what God has said. These are God's statutes. These are God's regulations versus the regulations of a mere people group. And so God says to them, if you end up having the same statutes and regulations, you end up actually having the same practices as these other nations, I'll kick you out of the land as well. In fact, it says the land itself will vomit you out. He'll put a judgment on the land where it won't allow Israel to stay, just like it didn't allow these other nations to stay in it. Now, what you've got there, remember what the land is. The land is ultimately Eden. It's the presence of God. This is God's land. It's not a particular people's land. He gives it to Israel as a nachalah, an inheritance, but ultimately it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to God. They can stay in it insofar as they're going to be God's images. So I want you to notice at the get-go, the understanding of land itself and the exile from land, either through death or through just being kicked out of the land, is a theme that's gathered from the creation account. And it's really important to understand that this text in Leviticus 18 is going to be functioning off of the creation account. And if you don't get that, you're going to think you're going to try to make it up about all sorts of other things. I've heard people say, well, really these sexual laws are about just male dominance, and they were worried about males being dominant. And so like with homosexuality, for instance, the concern was that the person just shouldn't be in a female role, and therefore that's why it was seen as wrong. That's completely bogus, and we'll talk about why that's wrong when we deal with the video of the guy saying that. But ultimately, that's not the issue at all. The issue, as we're going to see, has to do with procreation. These things are considered sexually immoral, even though it's not called that here. Later will be called that, but here it's not called that. But this is the understanding of what sexual immorality is in the New Testament. When the New Testament talks about sexual immorality, it's talking about Leviticus 18. That's very important to understand. We read Acts 15 last week, right? So Acts 15 talks about things sacrificed to idols and strangled, and animals not being killed the correct way, just like Leviticus 17. And then sexual immorality. That's the terminology for the stuff in Leviticus 18. So it's very important to understand that connection is going on there, so that you understand that this isn't merely something given to Israel and we don't have to worry about it anymore. This is sexual immorality as the New Testament is describing it. And so when we look at this and the principle behind it, which is a creational principle, we understand that the New Testament is condemning any sort of sexuality that is non-procreational, just like Leviticus 18 is. And so we'll walk through it and kind of see why or how that's occurring, why that's the conclusion that I'd make about this passage. So let's go down to verse 6. In verse 6, you have another section that is probably the largest section of the laws against non-procreative sexuality, and they deal with incest. And I want you to notice here that this is important to kind of go through this section first, not just jump to the next, because we're more interested in the next. We don't have a whole lot of people committing incest that we know of. I mean, not openly. No one's really, except for maybe small groups, no one's really advocating for incest as something being okay. And we kind of have a natural inclination to be disgusted by it. And so it's not really that big of a deal in our culture. I imagine it will be, and it probably is, again, in secret. But no one's advocating for it, right? But it's still important to understand what's being said here, because ultimately what's being said relates to the creation account. Because you have to then ask yourself, what is all of this? Why is it that you can't like sleep with like your dad's wife or something, and that's described as your father's nakedness? Why is it that you can't sleep with a brother or sister? All of that, or two sisters, or whatever it may be. And as you read through it, what begins to emerge is the idea that, well, the reason why you cannot do this is because essentially it has to do with your parents. Like you ultimately are going to be sleeping with your parents because of a one flesh union. That is, if you sleep with the wife of your father, it's your father's nakedness. Well, why is that? Because the two are one flesh. Well, that's only a concept that the author would be getting from the creation account, the two becoming one flesh. It's the only time it's really said there in the Pentateuch. And so that idea is here. That's what it is. So if we understand that, we understand that the author is interacting with the creation account, and he's grabbing his principles from the creation account. Well, what's the law about sexuality in the creation account? You are to be fruitful and multiply, fill up the earth, subdue it, and rule over it. That's the law. That's the eating of the tree of life versus the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's the command that's given. That's why they're naked in the garden, and there's no shame at all. They're not guilty. There's no shame. They're perfectly fine. Because that's right sexuality. Well, the author is going to draw from that and say, okay, then let's apply that. That means no incestuous relationships. Why? Because in the ancient Near Eastern world, they saw very clearly that through incest, it was a high amount of miscarriage. People would come out deformed in some way, either mentally or physically. There would be curses, it seemed to be, on incestuous relationships. If you think of Lot and his daughters, for instance, even though Moab and Ammon don't necessarily come out deformed, they are the enemies of Israel. And so it's like, instead of bringing a blessing through children, it was viewed as, well, incest is going to bring a curse. And so these things are bad. They're anti-creational. God may make your enemies through that process. God may curse you for not having a right ordered sexuality because you're not paying attention to the one flesh union. We understand, of course, it's a genetic issue. But either way, God's going to use this to prohibit anything that could hinder or harm a child in the creation of that child. And of course, could harm the covenant community that's supposed to be filling up the earth at this point. Instead, it's contrary to building up that covenant community and filling up the earth. So that it functions off of that. That's why. So like if you sleep with your brother is the flesh of your parents. Literally, the child of your parents is the one flesh union permanently sealed. Because you're literally looking at half your dad and half your mom. Again, they don't understand that genetically, but they do understand that there's some sort of link to where it is half your dad and half your mom, because it was your mom and dad through which God made you. So if you sleep with your sister or you sleep with your brother, you're actually sleeping with your mom or dad. And so you understand then that that's wicked. You're not to actually do that. It brings about the curse of incest. And so this all functions off of the one flesh union. And it all is founded on the idea that sleeping with your mom and dad is incest and therefore wicked. And so every connection to your mom and dad, whether it's like you're the brother of your dad or something of that nature, or the sister of your mom, or someone who's connected in some way, or it's going to be your granddaughter, it's like, because that's connected to you, that's your own flesh, and so that's too close. It's going to bring about a curse. And therefore, this is prohibited. It's anti-creational. Now, to go back before we get into the next section, I want to kind of just further that out, right? So if you did not watch the Genesis study, I highly recommend that you go back and start from the introduction to Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, keep going on at least to 11, if not the whole thing. to see the foundation for what's being discussed here. It's very important that you get that. It is foundational. It is essential, as it says in Acts 15:29, that you understand that this is the core of what Christians need to get about worshiping God as his image and functioning as the image as a life giver, primarily, first and foremost, through sexuality, and then, of course, in other things as it spills out to other ethics. But if you don't get that, if you don't understand that foundation and what he's drawing from, you're not going to understand the principle here, and you're just going to be like, yeah, I think it's about something else. And again, there's an inclusio. So this is all about the same thing. It's sandwiched in so that we all understand that this is about right sexual practice in the eyes of God. Well, what is right sexual practice? Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply. That's how you use your sexuality toward creation. So just to give you kind of just a really brief summary of what we talked about in Genesis, the beginning of the creation account starts out with the earth is formless and void, right? God's going to make the heavens and the earth. That's the introductory statement. Or you can view it as a dependent clause. It doesn't matter. But ultimately it begins in this state of chaos. And the state of chaos is it's formless and void. It's tohu vavohu. Tohu vavohu means that it is uninhabited with human beings. I'm sorry, it's uninhabitable by human beings. You can't inhabit it. It's not somewhere you can live and thrive and all of that. And therefore, it's uninhabited by human beings. Bohu is uninhabited. Tohu is you're not able to actually inhabit the area. Genesis 1 then starts with God then reversing that. He starts to make creation a place that mankind can inhabit, and that's why he keeps saying it's good, it's good. What he means is it's beneficial toward human life and thriving. That's the idea. And so when things are not necessarily directly related, like for instance the bringing of the waters to the sky, there's still nowhere for man or anything. It's not necessarily anything directly related to man, and therefore it's not said to be good. It's just, that's it. So you have in the first few verses that reversing of the state of chaos to where it's not capable, you can't actually inhabit the world. Then you get the making of humankind, which is the reversal of the other, and he makes them male and female in order to reverse the other, so that the earth is inhabited by human beings, not just a couple, but then he tells them along with that, the command is to be fruitful and multiply, meaning that God desires that human beings participate in the creation of the world. That is, they participate in the reversal of chaos, which is a humanless world. And when they don't do that with their sexuality, when they actually participate in the reversal of that, when they work toward tohu and vavohu, when they work toward chaos instead of order and creation and filling up the earth with covenant human images, they are actually working against God and doing evil. When they submit their sexuality to God and they allow God to be creational through it, then they are actually participating as his images through which he uses as instruments to fill up the world with his covenant people. So this is why then, when we get to Leviticus 18, the author is like, okay, look, here's what God said to Moses. Here's what you need to understand. You are not to participate in a sexuality that is disordered, because it leads to chaos rather than creation. It does not lead to the filling up of the earth with covenant human beings. If everyone were to practice it, it would lead to the absolute emptiness of the world. It would lead to chaos again. You are doing the devil's work in your sexuality to not be procreational in your sexuality. Again, if you understand this, then all of these other arguments that people come up with, like, oh, well, I think this is about, like, cultic prostitution, and therefore it's fine to have a homosexual relationship in any other way. If you understand this principle, you understand it doesn't matter what type of homosexual relationship you are participating in. It's all anti-procreational. Doesn't matter if you're married doing it, or if you're a prostitute doing it, or you're worshiping some other god, or you're worshiping Yahweh with it. It really doesn't matter, because you can't worship Yahweh with it. You're rejecting Yahweh as your creator and the very purpose and task he gave fundamentally to humans. And what he's saying here to his people is, but you're not going to be that way. The whole world has fallen, but I've redeemed you. I'm holy. You're going to be holy. And that means I'm the giver of life. I am in that sphere of life-giving. You're going to be life-givers in your sexuality, first and foremost, and then in every other way. So very important to understand why we need to read this correctly, because as I said last time, look, this has a major bearing on how you view other things besides homosexuality. It has to do with what happened in the last century when it comes to birth control and abortion. The argument against abortion today is not the Christian argument against abortion. No one had to figure out when someone became a living human being, because it was just about physically murdering someone who already lived. That wasn't the Christian argument. The Christian argument is this: it doesn't matter when the person begins to live, because it's anti-procreational, and therefore it's wicked and deserving of death. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So let's go down here to verse 19, and we'll walk through this a little bit. So verse 19, the first one in the next section that's not dealing with incest, says, "You must not approach a woman in her menstrual impurity to have sexual intercourse with her." Why is that? Well, some people will be like, well, it's taboo. It's considered unclean, as we can see in other places in Leviticus. Yeah, that's true. That's not why it's here. It's actually talking about a moral thing here. This is really important to understand, that you're talking about something moral, because later on, there's going to be a punishment associated with it, which is different than the mere taboo. The ritual taboo, you're just unclean from it, and you just need to be purified in that ritual way, and then you can come back into the community. If you purposely actually partake in this, as we see in chapter 20, you're actually exiled. You're banished from the people. You're cut off. The karat language. You're cut off. That's different than if you accidentally get blood on you from intercourse, or let's say you marry a woman and you get blood on you or something of that nature, or you didn't know she was going to be in during her period and it suddenly comes on. Whatever it may be, you can be purified from that. If you purposely partake in something like this, it's actually, you're to be exiled from the people. Now, some people think the karat means you're to be executed. I don't necessarily mean that. I actually think that what it really means is that you're to be cut off from the people. You're to be exiled. There's two ways, of course, they're being spit out of the land, right? They're being spit out of the land by actually being killed, and therefore they're cut off from all the land of the living. Or they're being, just like the camp, they're going outside the camp, they're going outside the land, and therefore they're going into the lands of death, because that also is considered death. And of course, exile is one of the punishments. We see that they're exiled into Babylon, and that's the punishment. But many of them are actually killed in the land as well. And so you have the same thing occur to Israel that God's warning them about here. And so so why is that? Why are you actually cut off from the people? Why are you exiled for doing this? Because again, a woman, it's very rare that a woman would actually get pregnant if you were actually to sleep with her in her menstrual period. It can happen, but it's so improbable that it's like, it can happen that if you sleep with your sister, you have a child who's fine. But it's a high probability that the child won't be. Same thing here. There's a high probability that it will not be procreational, and therefore it's prohibited. You wait until it's done, and then you come back together in a marriage relationship. By the way, notice that that's in a marriage relationship. It would be. There's no other relationship identified, if you were sleeping with a prostitute maybe or something. But obviously this is talking about, again, any relationship like that, including marriage, which means that marriage does not sanctify whatever sexual act you participate in. Just because you're married does not mean that suddenly what was prohibited is somehow okay. No, it's not okay. Marriage doesn't sanctify homosexuality. Marriage doesn't sanctify this type of thing. Marriage doesn't sanctify relationships in that regard. It sanctifies a ordered relationship, an ordered relationship between a man and a woman who are married and they're going to actually have a sexuality that is procreational. Then marriage sanctifies it. Otherwise, you're still just practicing pagan sexuality, and you're not actually functioning as the image. So next one, this one is interesting because this tells us a little bit that we are talking about children here, but the way that the Net Bible and other Bibles translate this, it really obscures it. So I'm going to read what the Net Bible has here, and then I'm going to read it from the Hebrew and show you how different it is. You must not have sexual intercourse with the wife of your fellow citizen to become unclean with her. Now, translated like that, you might just think, why didn't it just say don't commit adultery again? Well, that would have been easy. But the way it's translated, it's not just talking about mere adultery in the sense of ownership issues. It's talking about it in the way that we spoke about it before when I went through the Ten Commandments, that it's actually robbing a husband of the opportunity to have his child created through his wife. But ultimately, it's going to get the child killed here. So let me walk through this here. So verse 20, I'll translate it literally first. So, and into the wife of your fellow person and of your people. So that's your fellow countrymen. Some people translate it, but it's your fellow person. The neighbor idea basically is the idea. So into the wife of your fellow countrymen, you will not give your copulation as seed, as offspring, to defile inside of her. Now, you can translate this to be defiled with her. The infinitive is often used, though, in an actual active way, not just a passive way. You can translate it either way, but I think that if you take the context of what's occurring here, it makes more sense to translate it as to defile inside of her. That is to make the inside of her useless as to what it was designated for. That's what tame ultimately means. It's to make something, render it useless for what it was actually made for. So, for instance, Josiah will render useless the temples of the idols by just wrecking them and all of that. And so they can no longer be used to worship those gods, which is what they were made for. Now, that's a good defiling. Here, though, is that she's being the inside of her is being defiled and not used for the original purpose for which it was designated. Instead, it's your neighbor's seed, your neighbor's copulation. Literally, it's your neighbor's. Now it's you're bedding her or something of that nature, but it's copulation, it's semen, to function so that it becomes offspring, seed, your seed, and not the seed of the actual husband. And so I want you to notice that this is concentrated on the child then, and the defiling of the woman in terms of her being able to have a child for her husband. And of course, they would both die for this. And unlike the Puritans, they would not wait for the woman to give birth and then execute her. They'd execute her right away. So the child dies here. So you're not filling up the earth with covenant children. This is a way to get children killed, and therefore this is prohibited in this way. Obviously, because of all this, you're not filling it up with the husband's offspring either. You're stealing that away from him. The next one makes it really explicit, and so we'll go back to the English here so you can see it because it's translated fine. Verse 21, you must not give any of your children as an offering to Molech, so that you do not profane the name of your God. I am Yahweh. So notice this here. You will not give any of your children an offering to Molech. What does that have to do with sexuality? Now, most people will read this and they're just kind of like, what in the world? That's just talking about, like, don't sacrifice your children. That has nothing to do with whether you practice incest or whether you sleep with someone else's wife or whether you sleep with a woman in her menstrual period. Like, those are all sexual things. But my point to you is that this isn't talking about just sex. It's talking about the purpose of sex, which is to fill up the earth with covenant human children. And since that's the case, you understand then that having sex and having children just then to sacrifice them to other gods is still using your sexuality in a pagan way, because you just did it to get children to then give them to the gods. And so even this has to do with right sexuality, because right sexuality has to do with whether or not you are functioning as an instrument of God to fill up the earth with covenant children. And killing them by giving them over to gods to sacrifice them is the opposite of that. So finally we come to our verse about homosexuality. Actually, I'm going to skip over it because I want to deal with the last one real quick. So verse 23, you must not have sexual intercourse with any animal to become defiled with it. I would say, again, that's probably defiling inside of it, meaning it's not for what the animal is not functioning now. The animal's to have an animal, not some other thing happening. And so you're doing something wicked with it. But again, you could still translate it as defiled with it if that's, what you want to do. And a woman must not stand before an animal to have sexual intercourse with it. It is a perversion. So again, why is sleeping with animals wrong? Well, you can, we'd be like, well, it harms the animal. And it's like, well, yeah, there's a little bit more to it than that, though. It's anti-creational, and it's therefore deserving of death. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment. Why is all this stuff deserving of death? Because you don't have any punishments here. You just have God saying, look, if you're going to be my people will not practice these things. So my people are characterized by not practicing these things. They're characterized by the image and functioning in that role of the image, which is to be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth as my covenant images. You will not do that. But in chapter 20, you are going to get the punishments, and they're all deserving of death. Like, they're all the death penalty. So why is that? Why is it the fact that you get the death penalty for all of it? Well, again, put a pin in that, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Going now back to verse 22. You must not have sexual intercourse with a male. So literally, you will not bed a male. As one has sexual intercourse with a woman, it is a toeva, an abomination. What does toeva mean? It just means something that's disgusting, something that you find foul, something that you find reprehensible, something of that nature. God is saying that that's what it is. It is that to him. He finds it disgusting. He finds it reprehensible. So you must not bed a male as one beds a woman. It is an abomination. So what does this word male mean? This is, a lot of people are like, the Hebrew word here is the word zakar. Yeah, and so something we should say about the vav here. The vav is picking up from the previous commands against incest. So these are connected things. Again, this is all an inclusio. They're all connected. It's not something different with incest than here. Incest is seen as anti-procreational. This is seen as anti-procreational, and therefore they're put together. And so the vav really is just saying, look, this is a continuation. So it's a continuation saying, look, you're not to do this. So with a zakar, a male, many people have said, oh, you know what? Zakar means boy. And since it means boy, it it's really talking about pedophilia, and that's really what it's prohibiting. But that's from doing a really bad word study, not understanding how language works. But essentially what it's doing is it's saying, look, zakar can refer to a boy, and therefore I'm going to make it refer to a boy here. The word zakar just means male, like in Genesis 1, which incidentally, that's where the author is. So you should, if you were going to go anywhere outside the text, which you shouldn't, but even if you do, it would be Genesis 1 then, the male there. And the male is being told to have sex with the female. I'm going to say that's probably not children. So you're talking about an adult male. And, of course, it refers just to male in general. It can refer to an adult male. It can refer to a boy. It can refer to an infant. It can refer to anything. It can refer to an animal that's a male of any age. Because male is just the classification of the gender. That's it. So it doesn't do anything. But here's an important understanding for doing word studies. If the verse itself does not limit what's called the unmarked meaning of a word. The unmarked meaning is if you just heard the word zakar, you would just say male. You wouldn't think of a specific type of male or any like necessary age or any of that thing. You would think of just male, maleness. You'd think of the gender male. Well, when it's unmarked then, you don't limit it by saying, you know what? That word was used in this other context. It was used in that context to refer to an infant. Or, in this context, it referred to an animal. Therefore, it's just talking about don't sleep with male animals. And look at that. The very next thing is talking about animals. And so you can just make some sort of connection there. But it's very clear that that's not the way you do word studies. Male is a generic thing, meaning don't sleep with the male, period, if you're a male. So if you're a man, you're not to sleep with a male as you sleep with a female. That's it. It doesn't matter. It's not, well, if you're a male, if he's a male prostitute. Nope. Well, if he's a male and it's promiscuous. Nope. Well, if he's a male and you're, maybe you're in a monogamous relationship, but you're not married. It's like, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the relationship. It's not limited here in the context, and therefore it's not for you to limit it. All of this nonsense of well, in the culture, they would have thought this way, and, well, they weren't thinking this way about it. It's like, again, that's all meant to change the context, change the reference, and therefore change what the verse means. The verse has a context. I just laid it out for you. It's talking about anti-procreational sexual activity. So sleeping with a male of any kind is anti-procreational. That's the context. So to come along and be like, well, you know what, I think it's just talking about males who are male prostitutes, or it's males who are promiscuous, or they didn't have that relationship of marriage back then between males. And now we have a loving relationship. It doesn't matter what type of relationship you have. It's all anti-creational, because as loving as you may be toward a male partner, if you're a male, you're not going to have a child through that relationship. Your sexuality does not produce life. That's the problem with it. That's the issue here. And when the Bible talks about sexual morality, specifically in the New Testament, that's what it's talking about. No one who practices sexual immorality will enter the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God will spit you out, just like this land will spit you out. You will not be allowed in. That's the point. So, no, you don't get to say, well, I was just born this way and God made me this way. No, we had a fall that occurred, and you have a sexuality that's distorted from the fall, because that's what's actually happening in the fall, a distortion of sexuality to where it's no longer man saying, I'm going to actually be in submission to God, and I'm going to be used as an instrument for life to bring in covenant children and help fill up the world with those covenant children. I'm going to use sexuality the way that I want to use it. I'm going to use it to mature, to gain knowledge, which is another way that the ancients used sexuality as a certain right, but not as a procreative thing. I'm going to use sexuality for pleasure in our hedonistic culture, but not for procreation. Sorry, No, it's all condemned. And that's why I said last week, look, many people I'm sure were offended. I'm sure a lot of people won't listen anymore because of it. But ultimately, we're condemning homosexuality, but this past 100 years, and only really this past 100 years, Christians, evangelicals, whatever, anybody claiming to be Christian in the West, have typically been practicing the same types of dead sexuality, pagan sexuality that characterizes the Canaanites and the Egyptians in this passage, and not procreative sexuality that characterizes God's people. And yet they've been condemning other groups for doing it. Now, I'm not making the argument that, well, therefore be consistent and just don't condemn those groups. I'm saying be consistent, condemn those groups, and condemn thyself. Repent, and now do otherwise. And if you can't do otherwise because you're too old or you're out of the situation, whatever it may be, teach otherwise. Teach the next generation to not fall into the trap of this one. Because we are where we're at right now with transgenderism and homosexuality and women's feminism and all that sort of thing, because we have not understood this as God's people. The world may be where it is, but I have a feeling the world is where it is because the church also failed. I mean, we're really interwoven with the world through a period of time there. And so we don't get it. We give it up. And so the world, of course, eventually gives it up. They're functioning off our same presuppositions, or we're functioning off of theirs. And that is that sexuality can be something other than procreational. You don't have to leave your sex open to God in any way. So that he can do what he wants with it. You can go ahead and be the God yourself and decide, I'm not going to leave it open. Well, guess what? If it doesn't have to be procreational, then why are you condemning homosexuality? If it doesn't have to be procreational, why are you condemning anything else, transgenderism or whatever? You don't need a male and female then. You can sit here and be like, well, you need a male and female role for the Gospels. And as I said before, yeah, you can just have someone play each role. And you can even switch. Wouldn't that be nice? But there's a reason why that role fits, to where Christ, joined to the church, married to the church, brings forth life, not death. So you need a male in that role and a female in that role, and it needs to be procreative in order to give that understanding that the gospel, that Jesus being united to his people, brings forth life. It fulfills the creation mandate, because ultimately it will fill up the earth with all God's covenant people. So you cannot make the argument that, oh, don't worry about it. You can have a sexuality to where you're not open to God, to making a child through it, and not end up with what we have now, which is people are like, well, I mean, you're not procreative in your heterosexual relationship, and therefore, why can't someone be not procreative in their homosexual relationship? You made this argument for the world. You're complaining about the argument that you actually developed for yourselves so that you could actually think that abortion and birth control were okay, which, by the way, most evangelicals, because they were duped by Margaret Sanger in the 20th century, thought abortion was fine. They were actually glad when Roe versus Wade came out. You may not know that, but that is the case. Most evangelicals were happy about it. They agreed with Margaret Sanger. She did a really good job. It took the entire country. I mean, in the United States and Canada, and even in England, you had laws in the United States and Canada that were called the Comstock laws. You could not actually practice birth control. It was illegal, and certainly not abortion. Margaret Sanger comes along. It's like, oh, no, we need these things. Her whole eugenics program, all of that. Her original, you know what Planned Parenthood used to be called? It was called the American Birth Control League. That's originally what it was. She was all about birth control. Her argument was essentially about birth control. Abortion just kind of followed. And so, of course, evangelicals needed to develop a different argument if they wanted to get rid of abortion, but they wanted to keep birth control for themselves. They came up with the argument of, well, we need to figure out when the baby becomes a human, and then killing humans is murder, and therefore it's murder. But birth control is fine because the baby hasn't become a human yet, and therefore you're still okay with that. That's not the way Christians had argued. They argued this way. It's anti-creational, it's sexually immoral, and therefore it's akin to these other sexual crimes, which are akin to murder. Now, let me develop that one because that's the biggest problem that people have with me saying that. I want to just note again, I've not said that. I'm merely drawing out what the text indicates. Because when you go to chapter 20, it's the death penalty for these things. Now, this is really important. In a system of justice, which is based on the lex talionis, the law of reciprocation, you only get the death penalty if you've actually taken a life in some way. In other words, if you've actually committed something that's connected to murder in some way. If God commands that your life be taken for something that is not that, God's unjust, according to his own system. That means that God thinks these things are like murder. And how are they like murder? Because they're anti-creational. Because they rob humanity of human life. Because they rob God of the opportunity to create human life through the sexuality that he made by making male and female. So it is like murder. You know what that means? That means like you using contraception and trying to get in God's way and not being open with your sexuality in your heterosexual relationship is akin to murder to God. Because it's deserving of death. Homosexuality is akin to murder. So it's like, oh, well, let's be gracious towards Yeah, let's be gracious and reach out to them and try to save them, but let's not act like they're brethren when they're busy committing murder unrepentantly. Now, I realize there's a level of patience that you make toward evangelicals because they're completely deceived. If the case had been the same for homosexuality, I'd say let's be patient. It wasn't the same. We knew better. We know what the scripture says. It plainly says it. Like I'm drawing through it from inference about contraception. I'm not drawing from inference about homosexuality. It plainly says it. So there's not going to be as much tolerance over this issue because the scripture is very clear on the issue. Now, I think it's clear on the other, and so did the Christian church for 2,000 years. And that's actually something I can say. No, actually, everybody agreed for 2,000 years. Even the fathers and the reformers together, they all agreed that this was not just like, birth control is not only a sin, it was a sin that was deserving of death. Same thing. What else does this condemn? It would condemn everything to do with masturbation. Because you can't have a child through it. It would condemn necrophilia. It would condemn everything like that. It could condemn pornography. You cannot have a child through that. Obviously, pornography is connected to masturbation. But my point to you is that it's not as though these are exhaustive laws. Again, the law doesn't function that way. These are examples of larger principles, and that larger principle is the creation principle. So it is anti-creational to do these things. And therefore, it doesn't matter in what specific relationship you do them. Doesn't matter that, they weren't getting married as homosexuals, and so it's different. It doesn't matter. This has nothing to do with the specific relationship. It has to do with the actual anti-creational activity. And so the application would be, in a homosexual marriage, are you practicing something that's anti-creational in your sexuality? Yeah. Is it condemned then? Yeah. That's it. There's nothing else about it. So anyway, I wanted to kind of walk through the passage a little bit to show that because I think it's important. But next time, we'll do a part 1, part 2 because it's getting kind of long. Next time, we're going to look at these actual arguments that are made on YouTube just by a variety of people who think that they have great arguments. Obviously, you know now how I'm going to probably undo it. But there are certain things that grammatically and semantically and all of that are just lies that people tell because, one, I think that it's convenient to tell them, and two, they may not even know that they're lies because they just don't know the language. They're just using the language as an apologetic for homosexuality. So we'll look at that next time. I hope this was helpful to you, and thank you for joining us. God bless.